Great,
Lisa.
thank you. Good morning, Chair Ryback and members of the board. Mayo Clinic has recently embarked on a strategic plan, a 2030 strategic plan. It's called Bold Forward, and it is a bold plan. And I'd like to introduce Adam Brace. He's the division chair for strategic intelligence in the Planning Services Department. Mayo's strategy will always have ramifications to what we do on the DMC front, so thought it would be really helpful for you to see that vision and strategy moving forward and how we intersect. So I'll turn it over to Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Chair Ryback, members of the board, it's a pleasure to be here on the behalf of Mayo Clinic today to share a little bit about our journey to 2030. What I'm going to share today is the background that gets us to our strategy. You're going to hear a lot about the look that we did into the future to determine what changes need to be made, what changes are expected in healthcare, and generally in the broader macroeconomic environment that apply to the way that we operate and we plan strategy. Our process really started with an in-depth review of what we expect to happen over the next 10 years and maybe even a little bit beyond that. It was the most in-depth review that Mayo's ever conducted as part of a strategic planning process. Then we paint that vision for the future, and we work backwards from that, thinking about our strategy and the things that we'll need to deploy over the next several years to be successful in that environment. So the first half of this presentation is really going to be about what we expect to occur over the next 10 years, that environment that we'll all be living in. The second half is really Mayo's response to that. So we'll dive in. If you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me, and we'll get through this. So first of all, not surprising to anyone, industries change. Industries change because the environment changes, because economics change, because technology emerges and disrupts industries. Healthcare is no different, although healthcare, you may argue, is behind other industries. If you look at what's happened in banking, in finance, in hospitality, in retail, very significant changes in those industries over a relatively short period of time. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. For healthcare, we're still operating in an older business model, and that business model is coming under pressure from a number of different sources. And we'll talk about those changes that will impact our environment as well. So I mentioned this look that my team did into the future. And as part of that, we engaged futurists, we talked with leading industry experts, we talked with others outside of the healthcare industry. We reviewed more than 200 research reports, and we identified 100 trends that could potentially impact healthcare in the next 10 years. Out of that, we narrowed it down to 30 and then distilled it down to 9 to 10 key things that we think are major disruptors. And I'm going to walk through those so that you have a sense for the background of some of the things that we're projecting. First of all, artificial intelligence and innovation, the technology that's emerging. When you pair that with the data that's generated in healthcare, which is massive, you apply artificial intelligence, machine learning to that, you can unlock things that we can't unlock today. We're seeing most significant investment occurring in artificial intelligence in healthcare. So we know that this is an era of opportunity for us over the next 10 years, but it's not without its challenges. Cybersecurity is something that's on the minds of everyone, just about every industry, and healthcare is not immune to that. If you think about the number of connected devices that are in any hospital environment, it raises that level of risk. And certainly as technology advances, it advances for hackers as well. Cybersecurity is a significant risk. Because of the model that we're in with healthcare, we're ripe for disruption from technology. Technology can solve a lot of the problems that consumers have with healthcare. What they probably can't solve is the emotion component of it. That's why it's been slow to adopt. But big tech is making inroads into healthcare. Even this morning, you see news from Google and their efforts with a number of hospitals across the United States to integrate their data, their patient records, to see what they can learn from that information and ultimately improve patient care. Consumerism. So we all carry around these. We wait about 3 nanoseconds to get an answer to any question that we have from Google. We can purchase things with one click from Amazon, and so we're consumed by that environment, right? We're all used to being able to get what we want, when we want it, how we want it, delivered the next day, or maybe even within an hour. It's probably not fair, but that environment is coming to healthcare, right? We should expect that of the healthcare environment. When you have a disease, when you have a condition, you should expect answers that come much more rapidly thanks to this environment that surrounds us. We know that there will be an economic downturn, probably 2 of them over the next 10 years. If you look historically, economic downturns occur about every 7 years. We're well beyond that. Probably not going to happen before an election, but shortly thereafter, we do expect an economic downturn. Job losses will come with that. There's been significant efforts made with automation in the background over the last decade, but there hasn't been the reason for employers to implement that automation because the economy has been driving so well. As soon as you have an economic downturn, suddenly it allows the opportunity for us to implement that automation. And what we would expect to see is job losses. Healthcare, from a macro environment, is increasingly unaffordable. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that we hear about the talk about a single payer plan. We hear about issues with unaffordability and access, and that continues to increase. As you pair some of these things, you start to run into trouble as you think about unaffordability over the next 10 years for healthcare. If healthcare is inaccessible and unequal to a large volume of people, there's going to be a change that needs to be made. And then finally, we talked a little bit earlier about innovation, acceleration, just the pace of change.
1 minute, please, Mayor.
Yep.
Can I ask you a question? I'm thinking about the job losses. And because we're in a time where we have a hard time filling jobs, is the job loss going to be as dramatic as maybe in the past because we have a workforce shortage?
Right.
So as we automate and as people lose jobs, can they not be placed more quickly than in the past, or am I misunderstanding that?
It's ironic, Mayor, because as you look at the current environment, one of the challenges is finding the employees to do the jobs. As you look at the future environment, what we'll see is a need to reskill or upskill to different jobs.
So it's the training
right?
component. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Cybersecurity, how many times a day or a week is Mayo's door knocked on by hackers?
I don't know the exact number. It's a lot, right? We have a very strong, I don't know the exact number, but it is a significant number. And we have a very sophisticated team that works on that every day. Yeah.
It's comes from all over the world, right?
All over the world, yeah. Finally, what we see is this rise in social division. And when you think about that and relate that to healthcare, this separation or potential separation between the haves and have-nots, those that can afford the most sophisticated, most groundbreaking treatments, and those that cannot. And that may be okay in some environments, some economic environments, whether if you're a have and can go to Disney and maybe you have not and can't go there, that's one thing. In healthcare, that's a very different story. And so we see challenges with that as we look to the future. When you look at the rising rate of unaffordability of healthcare, as you look at new advancing treatments and how they may or may not be covered by insurers and others, that presents some unique challenges for the global environment. So then we take all of that information and we put it together in a couple of ways. We look at, okay, what does this really mean for us? Present itself as a variety of variables, and that's why many industries miss that. They try to time it based on one event, one thing that they think will be massively disruptive, and it turns out it's a bunch of little things that suddenly transform an entire industry. And the challenge for us and for many industries, for many healthcare organizations, is that it may not happen until it's too late. If you think about the iPhone and its release in 2007, in the days before that, people didn't really think that would happen. In the days after that, consumers widely adopted it, and it transformed about 7 different industries all in one fell swoop. The other challenge that we're faced with is that we, as humans, are very adaptable. If something comes along that we like better, it makes our life easier, we are quick to jump on it. And obviously, the developers of that, if you're not a leader, trying to fast follow in this future environment is going to be increasingly difficult. We also have looked at other industries to see the change in those other industries. I mentioned banking, retail, and hospitality. And when you think about the way that you reserve a hotel today versus the way that you did that 10 years ago, it's very, very different. In fact, you can reserve a room in someone's house today, which you couldn't do just 3 or 4 years ago. And what we see is that the wave of disruption in those industries was actually over a very short period of time, 11 to 15 years for this time frame when you knew an industry and what it looked like to it looked completely different. Healthcare is on that scale. The challenge is we don't exactly know where it is on that scale. We know it's not at year 0, and we know it isn't completely transformed, but it's on that scale. So we have to develop capabilities. Those industries that develop capabilities, those companies that develop capabilities to withstand kind of the multiple different changes over the years were those that survived and thrived in that environment. Those that tried to just transform their business model or digitize their business model the way that it was did not. So that's what separates the Targets from the Sears and the Amazons. So then we got creative and we started putting these things together. And this is really a tool that we use this year for the first time and will continue to use, which is about a forecast for the future. So you put a bunch of trends together and then you decide what would happen if these things merge together? What would that look like in our future environment? And we developed 5 different forecasts, and I just want to run through them quickly. The first one is this idea of an accurate diagnosis anytime, anywhere. So if we think about 5G technology and the rate of data transmissions, if we think about the amount of information that's being generated and the ability to sort through that information very rapidly using artificial intelligence and machine learning, you could have the possibility of delivering a diagnosis on your phone anytime, anywhere, in any environment. That dramatically changes the way that we think about the delivery of healthcare, and particularly as we think about the delivery of healthcare at scale. So it opens where maybe in some cases, if you weren't confident about the diagnosis, the patient may need to travel or may need to go for more testing. If a physician is confident in diagnosis and it's available anywhere, it totally changes the way that you interact with individuals. The Patient Will See You Now is a forecast really about consumerism, right? And it's about consumers taking much more control of their healthcare, consumers having the data and then deciding who they want to allow access to it. If you think about healthcare today, the amount of data that's being generated by you as an individual through your watch, through your genetic testing, that may or may not be available to your healthcare provider is increasing. And we'll continue to see app developers and others wanting access to that data in exchange for value to you. Virtual interactions will outpace physical interactions, and that shouldn't really be a surprise. Everything is shifting toward virtual and digital. The question for organizations like us is how do you do that with a human touch? How do you deliver more virtual, digital care with that human touch that Mayo Clinic is so well known for? The fourth one is about research, education, and collaborations, and thinking about them differently. Traditional research models in healthcare are long-term models. Research occurs for many years, then there's testing before it moves to patient practice. In some cases, that's upwards of 17 years from the time an idea is found to the time it's implemented in practice. Future research models will be much more R&D focused, driven to find solutions to common healthcare problems and much more rapid turnaround expected. Education, because of that reskilling and upskilling need, will need to change. And quite frankly, the way that education has been done in the past is changing dramatically already. And then collaborations are all about how do you grow capabilities much quicker than what you have in the past. And then finally, old business models become obsolete. That's what we've seen in other industries. That's what we worry about in healthcare, is that the way of doing business in the past is not the way of doing business in the future. So we need to be looking for those new business models that help organizations like ours thrive in that future environment. So how does this translate to Mayo Clinic in our future? First of all, our mission and our vision not changing, right? We will still be who we are from the sense of what our main focus is, and that's on the needs of the patient come first, right? We will continue to strive to be that leading organization with serious and complex care that offers our counsel, our knowledge to others who are in need. What we do have is what we added as this part is an identity. As we think about 2030, what will Mayo Clinic's identity be? And it continues to resemble what you would see today, but probably delivered in a different way as we think about that future. Capabilities are going to be important for us, and we have a set of capabilities which we've been strong with over the years, and we have a set of capabilities that we need to build as we think about the future. So for instance, we have a very strong brand and reputation. We're well known for the patient experience. If you ask anyone who comes here, they often talk about that experience from when they walked in the door to the time that they left. Now, We have work to do on the pre-walking in the door and the post-walking out the door, but that's part of something that we need to build as we look toward the future. There are capabilities that we need to develop, much more consumer market knowledge. So for instance, if you look at Target and what they did as they went through this significant transformation, they doubled down on two things, right? So they doubled down on their technology and their data, and then they doubled down on their consumer insights, being able to take everything that they could learn about a shopper at Target and figure out, how can I improve that? And that is what's expected of consumers. How can I be very personally treated? I'm different than Lisa, so the way that care is delivered to me, the way that I'm communicated with should be different than Lisa. Pace and speed to execution is something that we could work on. Data and innovation is something that we have a lot of, but how do you connect that? How do you constantly learn from that, right? That's something that every large healthcare organization struggles with, is a vast amount of data created on a daily basis. And how do you understand and generate insights from that that can ultimately improve the care that you deliver? So that leads us to three primary strategies, and these are kind of woven in together. You can think about it as a single 2030 strategy for us, with the words Cure, Connect, Transform, and then that's supported by our people, innovation, and the environment that we provide care with. And I'm just going to briefly talk about Cure, Connect, and Transform. So Cure is really, how do we continue to advance the science of medicine? How do we continue to advance that top of the pyramid, as we would say, serious and complex care? How do we discover new disease, new illness, and how do we identify new treatments and deliver them in new and unique ways? Thinking about that through research and development, through innovation, but then also with a very consumer focus. So how do we continue to advance what we do today? How do we advance that in the future more rapidly and more boldly? Connect is really about, how do you connect this system for the benefit of the consumer? So how do you connect their knowledge with ours so that we can deliver a better experience? How do we connect our infrastructure so that we can improve our operations, so we can automate where we need to automate, but also so that we can become more efficient, we can create greater access, and we can deliver care at a greater scale. And then Transform is really about the next business model. It's identifying the next business model in healthcare. We believe that part of that will come through platforms. If you look at platforms and think about a platform like eBay as a platform, Uber as a platform, Amazon is even a platform, where there are large volumes of consumers and suppliers who come together and provide and get a service from that. Platforms have completely transformed the industries that they've emerged in, and we believe that that will come to healthcare. So Mayo is looking at what is the role that we play in platform development as we move toward the future. And that ultimately will redefine the way that healthcare is delivered and redefine healthcare as an industry, we believe, as we look toward the future. So there you go. This basically says that if we can do all that, we will be awesome, and that's what we hope for. But really, when we accomplish all of these things, Mayo Clinic will be in a unique position, and that's what we're striving for, is to maintain the uniqueness of Mayo Clinic as a global leader in healthcare, but probably one who does it in a different way than what we do today, that has broad reach, that has a very personalized experience, but is also recognized for the strengths that we are today. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any discussion or questions.
So let me just start it out, and what I want to do is have us put this within our work. So let me take off from the mayor's comment earlier about this strange dichotomy we have of a worker shortage. You know, a few years ago, it was really weird to get our head around a worker shortage because we were looking at high unemployment. Now there's this whole point that you're making that I think is so good, that we should be looking at what is a job dislocation. That argues from the really flat out literal interpretation we have to take in the works that we do. Does that mean we need less parking spaces? Okay. Then you look at this issue of talking about you looking at this issue of technology evolving and wanting to emerge as a global leader, which is logical, you are, and you presumably can keep that. And you also want a human touch, which argues that we need to do more to make this more of a destination. That's our job. And so how does somebody arrive in this town? So that means, for instance, easier parking or a better transit experience, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just trying to break this down into super literal things that you look at the environment of the rest of the place to execute yours, and that we do that. So I just want to open that a little bit for us as we look at that. What do you hear in our work that relates to this? And should this be changing our planning? And while I'm teeing that up for the board, what are you projecting on the number of people who are going to work here and visit here? And how does that change from the numbers we're using right now?
Right. So it's important to note that that we expect growth to continue in the physical and in the digital environment, virtual environment, right? So we know that there are a number of factors, even things seemingly as remote as climate change, that will relate to growth in patients here, right? The types of patients that come here will likely be different, more serious, more complex, may have a greater length of stay, but there will still be a need for patients to come here. So as we look at the next 10 years and even beyond that, we would expect to see an increase in the volume of patients that we're seeing here in Rochester.
Are you seeing that at the same level that was projected? And are you seeing that it's the same, it's coming from the same places? Or, you know, if you saw, for instance, more international travel, does that mean we need to send more international angles? I mean, I'm trying to really look at the baseline numbers we've been operating on. And I don't think you're going to be able to answer that right here. But I do think within the next couple of meetings, I'd love for you guys to come back and say, you know, we've looked at this and the projected numbers we have are calibrated differently now, and where they're coming from may be different, and the experience they want. That point about longer stay, for instance, is a very tangible thing we can get our hands around.
Yeah, what I will say to that is that we know as we look toward the future that we would expect much more of our patient volume to come from a greater distance. So global patient volumes, further distance domestically, we would expect to see, because we would have broader reach.
Okay. Mayor?
Yeah, well, now, the first thing that's missing from the presentation, I just want to clarify. The needs of the patient still come first. That isn't on your presentation, and it's on every Mayo presentation I've ever seen.
Yes.
So assuming that and thinking along the lines of Mayor Rybeck's comments, or Chair Rybeck's comments, as we look at longer stays, as we look at more international or long-distance travel, that changes a little bit the scope of what we might be thinking about with our airport and our needs there. With long-distance transportation, again, I bring back my favorite topic that's not everyone's, which is perhaps a high-speed rail connection between the Twin Cities and here, and how that might fall into our future. And we focus a lot in this town, and even on DMC in the discussion about our community, but as we have patients who are spending more time here, and perhaps more patients as the patient load grows, how might we want to think differently about who we're building for, and do we need to think of it a little differently? Right. And about the kinds of experiences and parking and transportation that might be a little bit different. And so I think your point is really well made, Chair Rybeck, about as this is realized, how can we continue to have a really strong line of communication as to how the changes are impacting the assumptions that we have about the work we're doing?
Yeah. Member Campion?
So I see two things that had jumped out at me from the presentation that I think affect our work. The first is it affects our work in that the success of Mayo really is the success of Rochester, and I see those things as fundamentally entwined. I saw the word trust in there maybe once, and when I think of the Mayo brand as an external consumer, I think the most valuable asset that Mayo has is patient trust. So as someone who's worked very, very heavily in the platform development of product platform development, what's going to be the differentiator for me looking at Mayo is the ability to maintain that trust. As you move into these digital services, as we've seen other large companies do, they've eroded trust by taking some shortcuts. So I think what we all trust that Mayo is doing is going about things the right way. I think that's frankly been the Mayo way since I've lived here my entire life. The second piece that I see that I think that this board really needs to be focused on is the increased demand for technology skills outside of the patient care. So you have a bunch of externalities in that, whether it's cybersecurity, if it's AI, if it's how we're doing connectivity to patients, all of that requires skill sets that aren't what would traditionally be thought of as healthcare. That is a single hop away, but a very, very valuable and important hop away. So as we reach out, whether that's the Mayo Medical School, if that's RCTC, if that's the University of Minnesota, developing the relationships that not just bring the students and bring the kind of educated outcomes here, but also bring the muscle to build that skill and to find those skills locally. I think that's critically important to the success of a plan that I see. So, I think it's really good to get on this early. I think it's imperative, though, that we start to go and engage, because I think there's been a lot of positioning of higher education in this community as supportive of the medical operation of Mayo. What I want to see is how are we supporting all the other facets of the future of medicine that are coming out here, develop that skill set. So it's really great to get this. I think as we look at that, I think transitioning what the DMC is going to do for education locally, it's really important that we start kind of down that path. So.
I just wanted to build off of that. To me, I couldn't help but thinking about just the changing demographics of the workforce across the state. I tend to spend most of my time with lower skilled folks in communities, but increasingly those folks are an increasing portion of the future workforce. And so to Councilmember Campion's point, what will the future of work look like? And again, there's always going to be a push to bring in brilliant talent and minds from across the world. I think that's going to be important. That has implications, obviously, for what DMC, invests in and helps to build. But increasingly, there's going to be a pinch in terms of trying to build that talent locally. And again, the demographers, who talk about state demographic changes will tell you that even if we maximize immigration and migration into the state, even if we grab and keep every Gen Zer we can, we still will have a talent shortage here in the coming years, which I think, to the mayor's earlier point, I actually think there's some interesting, we will be in a worker shortage really for the next 5 to 10 years, even with a recession. And I think the whole question around retraining. So one of the big challenges, I think, is going to be how do we train lower skilled folks to move into these jobs at a time when the jobs themselves are changing, right? In terms of digital literacy and so forth. In our work, we actually spend more time on digital literacy than we do actually training for the specific skill area that we're training in, because it's such a fundamental piece of a worker's skill set. So lots packed in there, but I think the question of workforce and the implications for DMC's work in the future and who are we building this community for, I think is a critical element that jumped out at me.
Great. Any final comments?
Well, in the last few months, there's a group of the CEOs of the largest publicly held companies in the United States who their objective in life has always been to produce the highest return for their shareholder. Earnings per share has been their goal. And in these last few months, several have gone public about the fact that that may not be the only stake in the ground, that their commitment to the well-being of their customers and their workforce and the communities that they do business in is perhaps more important than they'd given credit to in the past. And I've just followed some things that Google has been doing in the Silicon Valley. They are on a 10, 15, 20-year, multi-billion-dollar plan concerned about the well-being of the monster they have created in the Silicon Valley. And I didn't really see a lot of that in this, but it seems to me that Mayo's got to step back and think about not just the patient and what you do in healthcare, but the environment that you create as a result that you're here and in Cannon Falls and wherever you happen to be. And I think that's got to be a bigger part of what you're thinking about, just as Google's doing in the Silicon Valley than perhaps you're thinking about today.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Oh,
I just
I'm
had
sorry,
one
Lisa, go
other
ahead.
comment. A couple of responses. You were asking Chair Ryback about the numbers and making sure that our assumptions move with this change with Mayo's strategy. And what we did in the first 5 years, so the beautiful part about the legislation is it says every 5 years we have to update our plan. And this is a perfect example of why. So what we will do is make sure that we are in sync with Mayo again over the next 6 months to make sure that we are adjusting those assumptions. In the original plan, it talks about sectors, what number of jobs we think will come per sector, and we will do that again so that you'll be able to see what this shift and what it looks like, and we'll be looking at likely adjusted assumptions for the next 5 years. So I think that's very positive. Also, somebody, maybe it was the mayor, that talked about the experience and how this really comes down to the experience of those who live here and work here, but also those who are traveling here. We're working very closely with Mayo, with RCVB, or now Experience Rochester, DMC, to really, and community organizations to really talk about upping the game in terms of this experience, because the people might look different. The cultures might need to shift a little bit, and that means the businesses might need to shift their thinking as well. So we've got an experience work that we are doing that we will bring forward to you. Final comment I wanted to make was diversification. Mr. Campion, I think you're exactly right. We have to think about beyond healthcare, and we think about that a lot on the DMC front, and organizations are thinking about that as well. Because to diversify our workforce, it's really supporting, a lot of it does support healthcare, but it doesn't fall under the healthcare title, if you will. It could be technology, and we need to actually broaden our base, and we're working with community organizations, regional organizations, and state organizations to make sure that we do just that. So some of those things you'll see in the next 5-year update as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, why don't we move on to project updates? Lisa, let's turn it back to you.
Yeah, for project updates, as you know, we bring our priority areas forward and give you at least brief